Welcome to part 2 of my tutorial series on Excel Power Query. This tutorial series is specifically designed to show you how you can up-level your advanced analytics game in Excel using Power Query, not only to clean and wrangle your data in a very powerful and efficient way, but also to use Power Query itself to implement advanced analytics techniques. The subject of this particular video is Power Query's most excellent, most awesome, super powerful add column from examples feature. I use this feature all the time. It is so awesome, as I will demonstrate in this video. So I'm going to go ahead and flip over to Excel and just get started. All right, here I am in the workbook associated with this particular video in the tutorial series. And by the way, if you're interested in getting this file, all you need to do is check out the description below this video, and there will be a link to a GitHub repository where you can download this particular workbook. As I do in most of my tutorials on my channel, I'm going to use a famous machine learning data set, and this data set happens to represent passengers on the Titanic, where each row of data is an individual passenger, and each column is a characteristic of that passenger. So for example, we have things like their name, their gender, their age, so on and so forth. Not surprisingly, the column that we're most interested in this tutorial series is column B right here, the survived column, which indicates whether or not an individual passenger on the Titanic survived or perished. And not surprisingly, what we're going to do is frame all of the work that we're going to do in this tutorial series to try and enable our data to help us answer one specific question, which is, are there any patterns, behaviors in the data that are highly associated with survival? Because not surprisingly, that's a pretty interesting thing to know. Don't necessarily get hung up on the idea that this is a machine learning data set. Conceptually, this data table is no different than maybe customer data that you pull out of your CRM system. And instead of a survived column like you have here, maybe you have a column that says whether or not they converted from being a lead, which is a prospective customer, to an actual paying customer. And then you could do analyses to say, are there any patterns in the data highly associated with a lead becoming a paid customer? So this data set is awesome because it's a proxy for so many real life analytical scenarios. I'm not going to go through what all of the columns of data mean in this video. If you're interested, you can check out the description below the video. There'll be a link to a website where you can read what each of the columns means. Of course, I'm going to explain each of the columns as we progress through the tutorial series as needed. I'm just not going to go through all of them right this second. All right, we're ready to fire up Power Query and start doing some data cleaning, some data wrangling goodness. We're going to go ahead and source data in this video from this table, not surprisingly. Power Query can source data from many sources. And later on in the tutorial series, I will show you different types of data sources you can use. But for the next number of videos, we're just going to use this particular table of data as the data source. So how we get started with Power Query is we go up to the data portion of the ribbon up here, and we click it. And we want to be over here in the Get and Transform data section of the data ribbon. And specifically, we want to get data, not surprisingly. So what we do is we click the little down arrow here, and we go to From Other Sources. And we're going to grab data from the table /range. And if I click on that, it's going to fire up the Power Query editor. This is where we live and breathe when we're using Power Query to massage, to clean our data, and sometimes to actually implement advanced analytics scenarios. And what you can see here is the data. Now, if I click on the source tab here, or the source step, excuse me, you can see up here in the M formula bar that the data is coming from the Titanic_raw table in the current workbook. All right, so that's pretty cool. So the first thing that we need to do is get rid of the passenger ID column. And the reason for that is you can look at the data and you can see that it's a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, so on and so forth. This is simply a unique identifier for each passenger. And generally speaking, 99+% of the time, individual identifiers are not interesting for data analyses. In fact, in some cases, they can actually be detrimental. For example, if you're using machine learning, you definitely don't want unique identifiers. So we have passenger ID here, but other examples that you would find in the real business world would be things like customer ID, vendor ID, things like that. So we want to get rid of that because it's not helpful for us. So all we need to do is just click on this. So if it wasn't highlighted, let's say this column was highlighted instead, all I have to do is just click on it to highlight it in green, right click, and I'm going to select remove from the context menu. And that gets rid of it. And notice we have an applied step. Notice this is our ETL process as I described in the first video in this series. We're sourcing the data, we're changing some of the data types or the data formatting. And then I said, hey, Power Query, remove a column for me. And if I click on this, you can see here the M formula language, the M code that actually does this for me. So at base, what you need to remember is that Power Query essentially is a graphical user interface. It's a wrapper for the M query programming language underneath the covers. And everything that we're going to do today, you will see that the result of all of the actions that we do when we click around in the user interface produce M code. The great thing is that you don't need to worry about how to do the M code. You don't need to learn the M code because the GUI basically handles everything for us automatically, which is awesome. What we're going to do today is we're going to work with 4 columns of data. We're going to work with the survived column, the P-class column, and the name column, and lastly, the age column. Now, just to make things easier, I'm going to move some of these columns all the way to the right so that we can see them easier in the interface of Power Query. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on survived here, hold down my shift key, click on name, and notice how all 3 columns are now highlighted. They're all selected. And what I can do is right click once again, and in the context menu, I'm going to go all the way down to move, and I'm going to get a flyout here, and I'm going to say move to the end. And you can see here that they've been shifted all the way to the end of the user interface, which is exactly what I want. Next up, I'm going to go back and move the age column and do the same thing. So I click on the age column, make sure it's selected, right click, select move from the context menu, and then to the end. And now we can see the 4 columns that we're going to be working with in this particular video are now at the end of the column list. Makes it a little bit easier. All right, so this is awesome. We're going to use one of my absolute favorite features of Power Query, which is adding a column from examples. That's the name of the feature. And what it does is essentially it allows you to train Power Query based on data to find patterns in it. And then once it learns the pattern that you want it to learn, it will then automatically fill that entire new column with the data based on the patterns that you've taught it. And that's a bit abstract and it's a bit machine learning, by the way, but let me show you what I mean. It's really, really super cool. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the survived column here. And this is a very quite common scenario that you see in data, which is we're using a number to indicate some sort of category or some sort of label. And in particular, what we've got here is when the survived value is 0, it means that the passenger did not survive or they perished. And when the number is 1 in the survived column, it means that they did survive. Now, this works just fine for computers in many scenarios, but generally speaking, it's better to transform this data into something that's a little bit more human readable, especially if you're going to present findings to business decision makers. You probably want something better than 1s and 0s. And that's what we'll do with the awesome add column from examples feature. So how we do that is we click on survive like I've done here. You notice how it's selected. And then we go up to the add column section of the ribbon right here in the Power Query editor. We click on it. And the very first thing we see here is column from examples. And what we want is this right here from the current selection, because we're interested in building a new column based on the data only in the survived column. So we go ahead and click that, and we get a nice interface that says, okay, hey, we're going to add column from examples here. Go ahead and start typing in sample data so Power Query can start learning the pattern in the data. And this becomes really, really super simple because what we do is we go over here, and first up, I'm going to change the name of this column to be new survived, which I didn't spell correctly. Sorry about that. Survived. There we go. And now we're ready to start teaching Power Query or making Power Query learn the patterns from the data in the survived column. And it's pretty easy. We say, first up, we say perished here because on this row, the value is 0. And we hit enter. And now Power Query is like, I'm not quite sure what you're trying to teach me yet, Dave. So give me some more data. Give me some more examples to see if I can detect, see if I can learn what the pattern is. So then I just say, okay, let's put in survived here as a string. And voila. Notice that they automatically all get filled out now because there's only two values in the survived column, zeros and ones. That's all that's in there. So that's a very easy thing for Power Query to learn. But don't worry, Power Query can learn even more complicated patterns than this, but we're going to start slowly and then get more awesome in this video. Okay, so now I've got my new survived column. I just click OK. And you can see here, I have transformed the data from zeros and ones to perished and survived, which will be much nicer in my pivot tables, for example. But notice this, I am going to keep the survived column in my table. This is a good practice when you're doing advanced analytics work, is to keep the original source data along with any sort of transformed or cleaned columns that you're going to use. Because sometimes, for example, if you use machine learning, having both columns of data can be potentially very, very useful. So there's no downside to keeping the column, so just keep it in there. All right, enough said. Next up, we're going to transform P-class, and notice how we're layering on complexity here. So if I click on it once again to highlight it, I can then go up here in the ribbon, or if I'm more likely, I'm going to go ahead and just right click, and from the context menu, I can select add column from examples from the context menu. And I get another column here. Now we're going to do P-class. And P-class is, once again, using numbers to denote labels or categories. So if you have a 1 in the P-class column for your row of data, you were a first-class passenger. If you had a 2, you were a second-class passenger. And not surprisingly, if you had a 3, you were a third-class passenger. So let's go ahead and make these strings because they're going to be a much easier thing to understand in our pivot tables and pivot charts and that sort of thing as strings rather than the numbers 1, 2, 3. So first up, we can just go ahead and make this new P-class as the name, hit enter. And all I do now is say, okay, this one is third class, this one is first class. And notice that it already auto-fills, but notice that 2 is a null. In Power Query, null is the absence of value. You can think of it as like a blank cell in an Excel worksheet. So what we need to do is train the feature here in Power Query to recognize that we want the word second. Notice how I'm just typing over the null there. The word second in this place, hit enter, and boom, we're golden. This is awesome. And notice up here, notice what Power Query does. It tells us what it's actually learning in terms of the M formula language. And even if you don't understand M formula language, that's okay. You can kind of look at it and say, yeah, if P class equals 3, then give me third. If it's 1, equal first, else if it's 2, give me second. That makes sense. That's exactly what we would want it to do if we talked about it in English language. So we just say, okay. And now we've got a new column of data right here, much more interpretable to humans than just using numbers. But we're going to ratchet things up even more. So next up, let's take a look at the name column. So let's say that you've loaded up the data in Power Query and you got your cup of coffee and you're in front of your computer and you're just soaking it in. You're just seeping in the data here, which is always a good idea, by the way. And what you notice is there is a convention. There is a pattern in the name data in the Titanic data set. So for example, we have Mr. Owen Harris Brond, we have Mrs. John Bradley Cummings, we have Miss Lena Heikkinen. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that correctly. I'm assuming that's a Finnish name. Down here, you can see Master Gosta Leonard Paulson. So there's patterns in the data. And notice this in particular, if we look at Master Gosta Leonard, this person is only 2 years old. And if we scroll over, we can see that this person's gender is male. Interesting. The master title, the master honorific here, appears to be indicative of a young male or a boy. So what we can say is, there might be some interesting analyses that can be done if we extract out, if we pull out these Misters and Misses and Miss and Masters and various other types of titles out of the names and just put them in a dedicated column. And you could certainly write all kinds of formulas in Excel to do this, but this is a much, much easier way to do it using, of course, mighty Power Query. So if I right click on this, I can then once again select add column from examples, and I can start the process of teaching Power Query how to pull out, how to just pluck out those individual titles very easily. I don't have to worry about writing any complicated formulas. Don't need to debug anything. It's awesome. Oh, and by the way, if you're familiar with Excel at all, this functionality is essentially equivalent to Excel's flash fill functionality. And if you're interested in that, I do have a video on flash fill, and I'll put a link up to that up here, but don't click it just yet because this video's got a lot more cool stuff going on. So we're going to go ahead and name this new column title, hit enter. And now we need to start teaching Power Query from the examples. So we say, okay, we got a Mr. here, we got a Mrs. here, we got a Miss here. And you can see that it's already learning a ton. But if we quickly scroll down here, we could say this particular name was too complicated for what Power Query's learned so far. So we need to help it along. We need to correct it where it gets something wrong. So instead of it being Planky, again, hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, comma Mrs., we'll just type in Mrs. here, hit enter, and keep scrolling down. You can see here Dawn got pulled out automatically, and all the rest of these are starting to look pretty good. So we can make a reasonable assumption that we've provided enough examples to Power Query that it recognizes the pattern in the data and will extract out the title just the way we like. So we click OK, and we takes a second, and then boom, we got our new title. Now to double check the work that Power Query has done on our behalf, we can just go ahead and click the drop down here, and that pulls up the filter, which is much like what you see in Excel. And we can see all of the various titles that were extracted. And they all make sense. And the Countess, we can just leave that in there for now. So the Countess, Sir, Reverend, Dr. Don Jonkier, which by the way is a Dutch honorific of nobility. So we can see here we've pulled out all the titles in the data. Awesome. Just click cancel because we don't need to do anything with that. And I mean, look at that. It's just awesome, right? You don't even have to worry about the actual way to write the code, because right here you can see in the M formula bar, this is the actual M code that actually produces what we want. And we could have wrote this ourselves if we really, really wanted to, but why do it? Just use the web interface, or not the web interface, the graphical user interface, and just teach it how to do it. And this is great. I love it. And I know how to code, but I still like it. I still do it this way because it's so much easier. All right. So the last example of how add column from examples is so powerful is the age column here. So let's take a look at the age column. If I click on it, you can see we got 22, 38, 26, 35, 35, and null. So in Power Query, when you have a missing value, you get the value of null. And if you're familiar with databases, this is how databases work, as well as programming languages in general. But what we want to do is we want to actually track, from an analysis perspective, are there any interesting patterns in the data if there is an age present versus there's an age not present? So for example, maybe people whose ages weren't recorded, maybe they are more likely to survive, or maybe they're more likely to perish. That would be an interesting thing to know. And we can use add column from examples very easily to add a new column to tell us whether or not there was an age present or not. And let's go ahead and do that. So once again, I'm just going to go ahead and right click, and I'm going to go ahead and select add column from examples, and that adds a new column. And I will just call this age missing. Oops, you know the rest in there, age missing, hit enter. Okay, and now we need to teach Power Query how to recognize the patterns that we're interested in. And this is going to take more examples than we've seen from the previous columns that we've created so far. So I will go down to null first and foremost, and I will make that missing and hit enter. And you can see up here that Power Query says, look, I need more data. Please give me more samples to understand what's going on. And you can say present, 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 and lo and behold, look at that. Awesome. Null, but see, notice that 3 is still missing. So we'll say present, oops. let me correct that. Present. And it looks like we're doing pretty well now. Looks like everything is finally going. And you can see over here, finally, we got the right M formula code. Once again, if you don't know what M formula code is, it doesn't matter. You can kind of look at it and it looks right. If age is null, then missing, else present. Cool. So we click OK. And now we've got our first step in wrangling and cleaning our data to allow us to do really cool analyses. So let's do some analysis. Let's run a pivot table on this transformed data. Now, the best way to do this, in my experience, is to save this off as a connection. which stores it in the workbook and allows you to produce the results of all of these applied steps every single time you want them. Okay, so how you do that is quite easy. So if we go over here to the home part of the ribbon in the editor, click on the down arrow. We don't want to close and load right now. We want to click down on this arrow and close and load to. That's what we want to do. And we want to save this. We want to load this as only a connection. And this will allow us to reuse this thing over and over again. And I will demonstrate that here shortly. So I click OK. And you can see here that we now have our connection. Excuse me, we have our query. And if I hover over it, I get a preview of the resulting table. But I don't like this name, so I'm going to go ahead and rename this by right-clicking on it and selecting Rename from the context menu. And I'm going to call this main ETL. Hit enter. Now, if I want to use this query to generate the data, run all those applied steps, generate a table, and then stick it into my workbook as an asset, all I have to do is right-click on it and then select Load To. So if I click that, Load To, and now I can say, aha, I would like to load me a table. And I'm going to go ahead and put it in a new worksheet. And I'm going to click OK. And what you can see here is Power Query generates me a worksheet called main ETL, because that's the name of the query. And now I get a nice table of data, and notice that it's green as opposed to blue. I like that because for me, it denotes which is a raw standard kind of Excel table versus one that was created from Power Query. And this green tells me that it's from Power Query. So I'm going to go ahead and close this here because I don't need it and it's taking up real estate. So let's go ahead and let's analyze this data. Let's throw in a pivot table. So let's go ahead and click in there, click on Insert in the ribbon, insert a pivot table. I'm going to go ahead and put it in my existing worksheet here at Q2. Click OK. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and scroll over a little bit. And I'm going to go ahead and pop this out so that you can see it a bit better so it's not covered up by my face here. Good. Okay. So sweet. Now we can use those new columns that we built to do an analysis. And let's take a look at the survival rates by title and new P class, for example. So we can go ahead and just drag title down to the rows. And you can see all the titles here, which is pretty cool. We drag new P class down. Notice how this is so much better than it being 1, 2, and 3 already. And then we can drag new survive to the columns, drag it again to the values, make it counts. Percentages are usually better to look at. So we're going to go ahead and change that to show values as percentage of row total. Click OK. And boom, look at all of this goodness. So for example, let's go ahead and scroll down to masters here. These are pretty cool. We got masters, that is passengers with master as their title in first and second class. And check this out, right? Look at that. 100% of the passengers in first and second class that have the title of master survived. But when you go to third class, the survival rate is only 39.29%. Now that is a super interesting analytical result. And it's even more interesting because with the data cleaning that we've done, it's eminently interpretable. It's eminently accessible by any human, essentially, right? It's better than 1 and 0 for survived and 1, 2, and 3 as numbers for the classes. And once again, the title is now super, super interesting because we can see here that some of these funky titles, or rare titles if you like Dawn, They All Perished, very, very interesting. When the next video in the tutorial series is ready, it'll be either here or here. And in the meantime, what I will do is put up a couple videos related to Excel data analysis that you might find interesting. If you found this video useful, would you mind gifting me a like here on YouTube? That makes it very easy for this content to get distributed to other professionals that might find it useful. Until next time, please stay healthy, and I wish you very happy data sleuthing.